Let's take a look at what ADHD actually is and why there are still many people who have gone undiagnosed when they definitely should have been. There are many people I hear that say, oh, I probably have ADHD, after they hear the criteria/symptoms needed to diagnose ADHD, and that's because a lot of them are actually pretty basic. Like, for example, one symptom is often blurts out answers before the question's been completed, which could be a symptom of ADHD, or they could just be a little rude. A diagnosis is made up of more than just a list of symptoms. So before getting into ADHD, let's talk about something a little more basic, which is what is a disorder according to psychology. The American Psychological Association, or APA, defines a disorder as a group of symptoms involving abnormal behaviors or physiological conditions that cause persistent or intense distress or a disruption of physiological functioning. It also defines mental disorders as any condition characterized by cognitive and emotional disturbances, abnormal behaviors, impaired functioning, or any combination of these, and the disorders can't be accounted for solely by environmental circumstances. Now, great, I said the definition, but what does that mean? Basically, the symptoms a person experiences must cause them persistent or intense distress or meaningfully disrupt their ability to function in daily life. I think it's important to keep in mind, what a disorder actually is, because I remember a time when my friend with ADHD was explaining what it feels like to someone who doesn't have it. He mentioned common symptoms like difficulty focusing and restlessness. The other person then said, a lot of people feel this way sometimes, so I don't see how that's actually real and ADHD's a thing if that's all it is. I was pretty dumbfounded at the time, but I tried to stay out of the conversation since I wasn't really a part of it. The reason I mention this is because a lot of people understand a list of symptoms, but kind of miss the point of what it actually means to have a psychological disorder. Since a disorder needs to cause problems in a person's life and or cause them significant or persistent distress, being able to relate to the symptoms of ADHD but having them be really minor and not actually impact your life indicates you probably don't have ADHD or an underlying problem. It's normal to feel restless, be distracted, and sometimes procrastinate. We all do it, to some extent at least. Most of the information about ADHD that I'll be quoting comes from the DSM, or personal experience. The DSM's full name is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and it's the handbook used by healthcare professionals in the US and many parts of the world. It's basically the main guide on diagnoses and mental disorders in general. That being said, not all people use them, but it's kind of like a rule of thumb type of a thing. Okay, so now that we know what a disorder is, let's get into what category of mental disorder ADHD falls into. ADHD is considered a neurodevelopmental disorder. This type of classification includes many other conditions besides ADHD, like communication disorders, motor disorders, and autism spectrum disorder. These disorders share a handful of similarities, like they all present in early development, they affect a child's brain and nervous system, and all neurodevelopmental disorders are characterized by developmental deficits that impact functioning in personal, social, academic, or occupational areas. The main features of ADHD are a persistent pattern of inattention or hyperactivity/impulsivity that interferes with functioning or development. ADHD can be split into two main types, which are inattentive and hyperactive/impulsive, each with their own set of symptoms and criteria that a person must meet to be diagnosed. That being said, there is a third type that is a combination of both inattentive and hyperactive symptoms. This third mixed type of ADHD is generally used when someone doesn't fit neatly into either of the other two types of ADHD. Inattentive ADHD manifests as behaviors like disorganization, wandering off tasks, lacking persistence, leaving tasks unfinished, and having a difficult time sustaining a constant focus. People with hyperactive ADHD typically display excessive motor activity such as running around in situations where you're meant to be still, excessive fidgeting, tapping, or high levels of talkativeness, which often cause disruptions in places like the movies, class, church. The impulsivity that is often included with the hyperactive type of ADHD includes hasty actions that are done without any thought for the future, and may have a high potential for harm, like running across the street instead of waiting for a crosswalk. Impulsivity may also take the form of social intrusiveness, like constant interrupting conversations or making in-the-moment decisions without any real thought for future repercussions. I do want to say that while ADHD symptoms are always present for those with the disorder, they may appear absent in certain situations, like when a child's distracted with an iPad, or is in a new environment or having a novel experience, but the symptoms are always there and will return once the situation that's generally distracting them is over. Okay, so finally, let's dive into the actual symptoms that are often used to make a diagnosis. First, let's start with the inattentive type of ADHD. And to start out, you need 6 of the following symptoms if you're under 17 years old, but if you're 17 years or older, you only need 5 of the following symptoms for the inattentive type of ADHD. Okay, so I'm just going to list them all for you. Often does not give close attention to details or makes careless mistakes in schoolwork, at work, or during other activities. Often has difficulty sustaining attention in tasks or even while playing. Does not listen when spoken to, even if it's directly spoken to, and can often be described as mind in the clouds. Often does not follow through on instructions and fails to finish tasks like schoolwork, chores, or other responsibilities. Often has a difficult time managing and organizing tasks and materials, which can be work-related or personal belongings, basically being unorganized. Often avoids, dislikes, or tries to get out of tasks that require sustained mental effort, like writing papers, doing homework, or preparing reports. Often loses things that they need, like schoolbooks, pens, wallets, keys, glasses. Is often distracted by unrelated tasks or objects. This can also take the form of random and distracting thoughts. It does not need to come from an external source, and once a person gets a little older, being distracted by thoughts happens much more than being distracted by an object or a task. And finally, is often forgetful in daily activities and responsibilities, like doing chores, running errands, or remembering appointments and plans. So those are all the symptoms that are directly associated with the inattentive type of ADHD, but I still want everyone to keep in mind that having a few of these symptoms does not mean that you have ADHD, because you need to have 6 of these symptoms, or 5 of them if you're 17 or older. And besides having the symptoms, it needs to cause persistent or intense distress and affect a person's ability to function, while not being better explained by something related to the environment around them, or, of course, another disorder. Okay, so I just wanted to reiterate the disorder requirements, because I think it's something that a lot of people don't know about. But, now that I've said that, let's go over the symptoms for hyperactive/impulsive type of ADHD. Often fidgets with or taps hands or feet, or squirms around in their seat. Often leaves their seat in situations where remaining seated is expected, like in class or at work. Often runs or climbs in situations when that's not really appropriate. The symptom can also show itself as general restlessness. Often unable to play or engage in leisurely activities, especially quietly. Is often on the go and can often be described as driven by a motor, and dislike being still for any extended amount of time. Often talks excessively. Often blurts out an answer before a question has been completed, an example being trying to complete people's sentences for them. Often has difficulty waiting their turn, and often interrupts or intrudes on others. Example of this is interrupting or trying to jump into other people's conversations. Other ways the symptom can express itself is that they may start using other people's things without asking or receiving permission, and they may intrude or take over activities that other people are doing around them. Now, besides the symptoms we just went over, both types of ADHD typically require a few other requirements for a diagnosis, which are: these symptoms must be present before the age of 12, several inattentive or hyperactive symptoms are present in 2 or more settings, like school, home, or work. A setting is basically kind of like a location. There needs to be clear evidence that the symptoms interfere with or reduce the quality of social, academic, or occupational functioning. Basically, it needs to be a disorder. And finally, the symptoms do not only show up occasionally, and they can't be better explained by another disorder. There are also associated symptoms or features of ADHD that do not directly count as a symptom, but instead count as something that further supports a diagnosis and are not considered directly caused by the ADHD itself, which may include mild delays in language, motor, or social development, and may include low frustration tolerance, irritability, or mood swings, and finally, problems on things that test attention, executive functioning, or memory. Okay, now that we talked about disorders, symptoms, and the features of ADHD, I really want to talk about some general confusion that it seems like many people have. This confusion is actually really fair in my opinion, and it's what ADD, also known as attention deficit disorder, is, and what ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, is, and how they relate to each other. In short, ADD doesn't really exist anymore, in the sense that it's not a disorder that actually gets diagnosed anymore. That is because it's been rolled into ADHD. So instead of having ADD and ADHD, a person is now diagnosed with just ADHD, and then a specific type can be applied as an inattentive or hyperactive/impulsive or mixed. Another piece of confusion or misinformation that I just wanted to clear up was that people think that adults can't have ADHD. And for many, many years, it was thought that ADHD was basically a child-only disorder and that they grow out of the disorder and that the symptoms would not persist into adulthood. But this idea has been largely discarded because when adults who previously had been diagnosed with ADHD during childhood or adolescence were tested again, they found that between 60 to 90% of those tested still had symptoms necessary to be diagnosed with ADHD. 60 to 90%, that's a lot of people. People who could have been thinking that there was something wrong with them because they continue to experience these ADHD symptoms that were supposed to have gone away. It really bothers me that there are definitely people whose symptoms persisted who thought that they had something wrong with them or that they were weird, because their symptoms should have gone away according to what they were told, but guess what? That's not actually how it works. I said previously that you may have ADHD without even knowing it. Many people grow up with ADHD and are never actually diagnosed, possibly because they didn't have teachers that were informed on the subject or previously not having access to mental health services. Now, there's probably a large number of people who are struggling with ADHD and don't even know it. So, under what circumstances are the symptoms of ADHD likely missed? Unfortunately, symptoms that are more associated with the inattentive form of ADHD are more likely to be missed, which is partially due to the fact that the inattentive form of ADHD is less likely to cause outward behavioral issues that would be more easily noticed by parents and teachers. Some people may be considered a bit scatterbrained, and that's it, when that could be something that points to ADHD. This can cause many people who have the inattentive form of ADHD to just never be noticed. I actually know a number of people that this actually happened to. Another group of people that have been largely ignored when it comes to ADHD diagnoses are girls and women. There are a few reasons girls and women in general have their ADHD symptoms ignored. One is that girls are more likely to show the symptoms that lean towards the inattentive type of ADHD, which again is more likely to go unnoticed and unaddressed. This is also unfortunate because girls with ADHD are associated with having an increase in the rate of depression, anxiety, irritability, and sleep problems. These problems and many symptoms that are actually used to diagnose ADHD are often ignored or dismissed as unrelated or blamed on simple things like hormones. Originally, it was believed that boys were significantly more likely to have ADHD compared to girls. It was thought that boys had ADHD at a rate that is 2 to 3 times higher. But new data suggests that girls have a similar rate of ADHD. So instead of being a ratio that's 3 to 1, it's much closer to 1 to 1. Which means that there's probably a lot of girls and women who were never diagnosed with ADHD when they definitely should have been. The amount of diagnoses of ADHD have been on the rise for a number of years, and some blame it on social media or smartphones, but I personally believe it's caused by a handful of other things. One explanation is that girls are being diagnosed more, which would be a welcome improvement. It would also be from people being more aware of the disorder in general, from things like movies, TV, or social media. Even if the information isn't fully correct, it can still make people aware of it, which can lead them to their own research and look into it themselves, then causing people to become more informed and knowledgeable on what to look out for and what to consider. And finally, it can be caused by ADHD having less of a stigma now compared to 20 years ago. I know in the past, if a school told parents that their child might have ADHD and suggested getting them tested, many parents would prefer to ignore the symptoms and problems, insisting my child can't have ADHD. Now, parents are significantly more likely to agree to having their child evaluated for ADHD when suggested. But I live in the US, and I know that compared to many other countries, specifically Europe and Asia, the US is a lot more open about mental health problems, which again lessens the stigma. So that covers most of ADHD. I hope this clears up any confusion you've had, and if anyone watching this is one of the people diagnosed as an adult, I'd really like to hear about it in the comments, and those of you who are interested in ADHD and resonate with many of the symptoms I've talked about, you should talk to someone about it. You may just be one of those people who were passed over and undiagnosed without even realizing it. Well, that's all I've got for now. Thank you if you've watched this far. If you liked the video, leave a like and subscribe. If you have any psychology topics you'd be interested in learning about in the future, feel free to leave a comment and let me know. And I hope you learned at least a little bit more about ADHD and can understand yourself and maybe those around you at least a little bit better. Until next time, I hope you have a good rest of your day. Goodbye.